A lot of students choose to take a gap year. Some of them, after finishing secondary school, they take a gap year before post-secondary. Some people, after they've finished college or university, they take some sort of a break before they begin their career in earnest. But that is not the only time you are allowed to take a gap year. Turns out adults can do this too. It's actually a thing. It isn't early retirement. It's not a maternity leave. It's not a paternity leave. It's like an adult gap year. So that is what we're going to talk about with Jillian Johnsrud. She's taken a number of these breaks over the years, and she joins us from Kalispell, Montana. Hello there.
Thanks for having me.
What was your first gap year? Please tell me it was somewhere glamorous and spectacular.
Well, the first one, I was in my 20s and not we'd paid off debt, we had started saving, but not the most well-funded. So I did a cross-country road trip, DC to Seattle and back in a month
Wow.
with my best friend in my old Honda Civic, and it involved a lot of camping and staying on people's couches and all that kind of young 20s
Oh,
stuff.
love it. How did you think about it at the time? Did you think about it as a gap? I mean, it was a month, not a year, but did you think of it as a
Mhm.
gap or did you just think of it as a long, indulgent vacation?
I had always known I'd wanted to take these mini retirements. So we had been working towards that, saving towards that, kind of optimizing our finances to be able to do this. And so once the opportunity arose, we kind of pounced. I always tell people you could have there's three different ways to take a mini retirement. You can negotiate the time off. You can take a natural gap in between jobs, or sometimes life will just provide you a random opportunity to have a month off or a year off. And you can, if you're prepared, you can seize
Yeah.
that opportunity.
Here in Canada, it's not common, but you can do something called a 4/5, where you work for 4 years but get paid for five because you've been on 80% salary for that
Mm.
time, or a 2/3, or some sort of program like that. Is it fair to say that people's awareness of those existing programs is relatively low? We don't hear a lot about those things.
It hasn't been very common for people to take career breaks, but I think, especially post-pandemic, it created this awareness of, oh, there's things outside of work that are important to me. I have friends and family and hobbies and my health and dealing with burnout that also maybe need some attention. And so I think it's becoming more popular, but also more needed.
Mm. What would you say are some of the ingredients that go into a successful adult gap year? And I add the asterisk beside that to say I'm sure it differs wildly between individuals, but what would be some of the common themes?
The common themes right now, I see a lot of burnout. It's a lot of things that you can't fit into nights and weekends. So things like extended travel, slow travel, big projects people want to take on, really meaningful things with their kids. And that's the other one. There's seasons in life with expiration dates.
Mm.
There's things that we could, if we don't do it now, it's going to pass us by, whether it's while our kids are young or our parents are healthy or we're healthy. So I see people prioritizing this just because there's this awareness of if I wait till I'm 65 to pursue these things, I might not have that opportunity anymore.
Yeah. Bungee jumping at 65 is still possible, but slightly harder on
Mhm.
the back than at
Yeah.
30, I would say. So there is someone, this strikes them as being something exciting. They've got
Mhm.
a vision for it, and there's the reality of it. So
Yep.
as you talk to people about how one brings this to life, what are some of the
Mhm.
things that they need to consider?
So there's always the finances. So if you have a program that kind of helps you save, that's fantastic. I encourage people, even if you can only take a month every other year, that requires an extra 6.5% savings. So it's not an enormous amount, but a month-long gap every other year throughout your life, like you can accomplish a ton of really cool things throughout your lifetime. So it's the extra little bit of savings, setting that money aside. And then there's the career part. Are you going to negotiate this time off? Are you going to plan a little break in between jobs? So starting to think through that. And then it's just the planning. How do you really utilize this time so that it's meaningful to you? And I always encourage people find the thing that's the most exciting right now, but also the most urgent right now. Like, what do you need the most in your life?
Mhm. Uh, for some people, the thought of having this conversation with a manager is just
Mhm.
deeply, deeply upsetting. As you think about, and I'm going to drive a false polarity here, but what is practical risk and what is
Mhm.
psychological risk? What are the things that people should think about before they walk into their manager's office?
The most important thing is to realize that you are adding a complication
Right.
to your workplace and to your manager, and their plate is full, and they don't have any bandwidth for more complication. So, doing as much work to prepare. How will this logistically work? Who will cover your work? How can you shift things around? What could you take on ahead of time to get done? What could be paused? Doing all of that kind of logistical and emotional labor ahead of time, so you come in and it can be a really creative and collaborative conversation. Like, here's what I need. I've got a bunch of ideas of how we can make this work so that it's a positive experience for everyone.
There is the simplicity of being a solo person, walking through life without the complications of being partnered, without the complications of having kids. But there are people in those circumstances too who could definitely benefit from an adult gap year. What additional insight would you have for people to navigate the other humans that would be affected or would be included in this grand plan?
I think for most people, kids are a fantastic motivation to take a gap year because you see how quickly they're changing. You see how quickly your relationship's changing. A kiddo in like second grade who just wants to be around you all the time and is so excited about everything is very different than maybe a 15-year-old who has their friends and their hobbies and their sports. So I think it's a good motivation, and including them as much as possible in those conversations. What are their concerns? What would they like to hope to get out of it? Uh, but at the end of the day, also realizing, there's 3 points that we enjoy something: looking forward to it while we're doing it, or looking back on it, reflecting
Right,
on it.
right.
And I have 5 kids, so there's 7 of us. That's 21 points. We are not going to hit 21 out of 21 for every single thing we choose. So, kind of acknowledging that, like, yeah, some things you like, some things, will be a bummer,
Yeah.
and that's okay too.
I'm the youngest of 5 kids, and in my
Oh,
family of origin, the thought of even taking a vacation for a week was an enormous logistical endeavor. I can't imagine trying to do that for a longer period of time, but we'll
no.
save that part for another day. I do want to ask you, how do you factor in your own personal temperament and passions with what is pragmatic? Because I think one of the pitfalls for me, if I were to think about this, is I'm a pretty type A oriented person. And if I was going to take an extended period of time off, I worry that I would set the bar too high. Like I need to be fluent in Cantonese when I return home, or I need to have won the Olympic gold in pickleball before I return back to my regular life. How do you navigate that so it's not a time of pressure? Or am I the only one who has that thought? Maybe I'm the only one who would have that thought.
That is a common challenge, is that people can be very overly ambitious and have very high expectations on themselves. So I encourage people to try to focus on things that are process based versus outcome based, because you might not get to that outcome. Especially if people are dealing with burnout. Oftentimes you don't feel the full effects of that burnout until you're away from the situation that's burning you out. And so you might be less productive and less motivated than you were hoping or anticipating once you get into the mini retirement. So pick things that you enjoy the process of, even if there's not a really specific outcome.
Clearly, it takes some initiative and
Mhm.
motivation for someone to make this happen for
Yeah.
themselves. There are those who listen to this conversation, they're like, yes, they are like talking to their manager tomorrow. There are those who are a hard no, that they thought this
No.
was interesting, they would never do it. Then there are people who are teetering on the middle. They see the opportunity, they are excited about it, but they're stuck sitting on the fence. What would be one thing you would say to kind of flick them over to one side or the other as to whether or not an adult gap year makes sense for them.
So I've done 12 mini retirements, and they're a hassle. They just are. And so knowing that going in, it's going to be a lot of conversations. You have to save money, you have to budget, you have to plan, you have to figure out the employment. But in the rearview mirror, if you think about this amazing thing you did 10 years from now, 20, 30 years from now, that hassle seems smaller and smaller and smaller. But the meaningfulness of that time away, the joy, the value of those memories only increases over time. So I would say if you ask your 70-year-old self what they think about a gap year, they might have a very different perspective of that hassle versus reward
Right.
ratio.
So insightful. Jillian, thank you so much for joining us to talk about this.
Thanks so much for having me.
Jillian Johnsrud has taken a number of these adult gap years or mini retirements over time. And I think it goes without saying that she is deeply passionate about the idea and would encourage everybody to at least ask themselves the question about where and what that gap year could include for them.